the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good afternoon. It's time to debate the big issues of the day with me, Gloria Piero, Liam Halligan, got your name then, and a whole host of experts.
Today we're asking, is the parole board fit for purpose? This comes after the double child killer Colin Pitchfork was sent back to jail just 2 months after being released on parole.
First, it's time for the news.
Good afternoon. Our top story at 2. Mourners are paying their respects to the politician Sir David Amess as a funeral service in his Southend West constituency. The father of 5 was stabbed to death while holding a surgery at Belfair's Methodist Church in Leigh-on-Sea in October. Sir David's coffin, draped in a Union flag, was carried to the church by members of Southend Fire and Rescue Service. Liam and Gloria will have more on Sir David's funeral in just a moment. Energy provider Bulb has said it is to enter into special administration following challenging market conditions. The company blamed the rising cost of gas prices and what it calls volatile market situation, but said it will still provide a service as normal to its 1.7 million customers. More than 20 providers have collapsed in recent months following a big rise in the wholesale price of gas. 5 people have died and more than 40 have been injured after a car ploughed through a Christmas parade in the American state of Wisconsin. An SUV broke through barriers in the city of Waukesha yesterday afternoon, hitting dozens of people, including children. One eyewitness said the SUV was doing 40 miles an hour when it hit the crowd. Police said a person of interest was in custody, but it wasn't known whether the incident was terrorism related. The Prime Minister says Britain can win the new green industrial revolution, but only if we act now. Boris Johnson has been speaking to business industry leaders at the CBI National Conference from the Port of Tyne in South Shields. He also announced that new homes in England must have electric car charging points from next year. The new measures will also force new supermarkets and workplaces, including those undergoing major renovations, to include charging points.
We're regulating so as to require new homes and buildings to have EV charging points, with another 145,000 charging points to be installed thanks to these regulations. We're investing in new projects to turn wind power into hydrogen, and the net zero strategy is expected to trigger about £90 billion of private sector investment, driving the creation of high-wage, high-skilled jobs across the UK.
Austria has become the first Western European country to enter a 4th nationwide lockdown to tackle soaring coronavirus cases. Austrians have to stay home and can only leave for essential reasons, such as food shopping, going to the doctor and exercising. Restaurants and most shops have closed while large events have been cancelled. The government will re-evaluate the lockdown after 10 days. Back here, the government is facing a potential backlash from Tory MPs over changes to social care plans. Previously, the government said there would be a cap of £86,000 on care costs by 2023, but it's now considering a change to how contributions are calculated. Council funding support will no longer count towards that limit. Under the plans, only an individual's personal payments will be considered. Once the limit is hit, the local authority will pay. Some backbench MPs say the changes could hit poorer people hardest. The least well-off may have to sell their homes, which would break a Tory manifesto pledge. Australia will begin to allow foreign visitors to enter the country from the start of December. Skilled workers, international students and refugees will get priority. They must hold an eligible visa and be fully vaccinated against COVID. The country did have one of the strictest border policies, allowing only a limited number of Australians and permanent residents in. And shoppers have been warned to be extra careful during Black Friday as millions of pounds were lost to scams over Christmas last year. Action Fraud, which is the National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime, saw more than 28,000 people conned out of their money during the festive period. That's an increase of 61% compared with the year before. Nearly £2.5 million was lost to criminals during the Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale events last year. That is the latest news for now. We'll have more for you in half an hour.
Coming up today on Piero and Halligan.
The double child killer Colin Pitchfork has been sent back to jail just 2 months after being released on parole.
Pitchfork raped and murdered 2 teenage girls in the 1980s. Many said he should never have been released. So we're asking, is the parole board fit for purpose?
And as ever, it's not just our guests we want to hear from. Join the debate with your view. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
And welcome to the programme. Today we're talking about the decision to recall the double child killer Colin Pitchfork to prison.
He was released 2 months ago by the parole board after spending 33 years in jail for murdering 15-year-olds Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in Leicestershire in the 1980s.
Pitchfork raped and strangled Linda Mann in Narborough in November 1983 and he killed Dawn Ashworth 3 years later.
Pitchfork was returned to custody on Friday over a breach of licence conditions. It's been reported that staff at a hostel where he was living had grown increasingly concerned about elements of his behaviour.
However, there was no suggestion any further offence had been committed.
Well, earlier on GB News, I spoke to Alberto Costa, who's the MP for South Leicestershire, where Pitchfork committed his crimes.
You're right to say that he met the criteria, but we shouldn't, or the parole board shouldn't abrogate responsibility. They made an assessment on the evidence that was presented to them. We don't have a sort of tick box exercise board where if somebody meets criteria, they're automatically discharged. The independent parole board, on reviewing the evidence from internal psychiatrists and other, made a decision. They chose to release Pitchfork, notwithstanding the repeated objections that I made, that many of my constituents made, and perhaps more importantly, the victims' families and those involved in the criminal justice system made. I recall being contacted by police officers and others that had been closely involved in the Pitchfork case, and they made their views very clearly known to the parole board that this is a man that could not change. Well, we've been proven right. And I'm very glad that the probation service have done an excellent job in recalling Pitchfork into custody. And I think my campaign now is focused on ensuring that not only do we have a root and branch review of the parole board system, but that we keep, more importantly, Pitchfork behind bars for the remainder of his life.
The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, is reportedly looking at reforms to the parole board. What sort of things should he be looking at?
Well, the government has rightly promised a root and branch review of the parole board, and I've been passionately campaigning for this for, as you well know, Gloria, for years now to get this root and branch review underway. The sort of changes that I think would be reasonable to make is to have a more open, more transparent parole board system, maybe even change its name to have a sort of public safety board rather than parole board. Ultimately, the role of the parole board is to protect all of your viewers, all of us, from any reoccurrence of crime from those that they choose to release. But it's important that we all get to see the evidence upon which they base their assessments, just as you would see in an open court if it's a criminal court where somebody's making a plea in mitigation, for example. All that evidence is disclosed to the public. I don't see why we should continue to have such an opaque system that we currently have. So there's enormous rooms for improvement, not least making the system much more open and transparent.
And Pitchfork could be eligible for parole again. He will be in the not too distant future. What can you do? You can't wait for the parole board to be reformed before that review, or can you?
Well, look, as I'm sure your viewers will imagine, given that I've been campaigning on this for 5 years, I have been in contact with the most senior levels of the UK government. And I think there's general political agreement that not only do we need these urgent changes to the parole board system, but we can't have another situation where a Pitchfork-esque individual's released. The parole board now need to do another job with Pitchfork. They need to review the evidence, and they now need to make another judgment call. And I'm going to be following this incredibly closely, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that the parole board reassess the original evidence that it had along with this new evidence. We need to ensure that Pitchfork is kept behind bars where he belongs to be. That's the only way that we can truly protect the public.
Alberto Costa there, the Tory MP for Leicestershire South, talking to Gloria earlier. Leicestershire South, of course, the part of the country where Pitchfork committed his crimes back in the early 80s.
We're going to speak first to a former prisoner who now campaigns for prisoners' rights. John Hurst spent 25 years in prison for the manslaughter of his flatmate. He was released from jail in 2004, and he joins us on the phone. Hi there.
Hi.
The evidence suggests that Pitchfork should not have been released for him to be back behind bars just 2 months later.
What evidence?
Well, because he has breached the terms of his release.
No, it's
license.
alleged he's breached the terms of his licence conditions.
Well, why do you think he's back in prison?
Well, because it's alleged he's breached the terms of his licence conditions. You know, you're saying it's a parole board fit for purpose. I don't think it is, but this issue is the probation officer has made the decision to recall him because he believes or she believes his risk is such that he needs to be back in custody. He then goes back into custody, and then the parole board decides whether the recall was justified, and if it isn't, then they order his release again. But if it is justified, then he will remain in custody for at least another 2 years, in which they'll have another hearing to see whether he can go back out again.
So you're concerned, John Hurst, that Colin Pitchfork's own human rights are being breached in case he's being returned to prison unfairly. You're right, there is some doubt about what the parole board is saying. Reportedly, Colin Pitchfork has caused concern because he's been approaching young women while he's been out walking. That is reported. That's not confirmed by the parole board. You're right, of course, that there is some doubt. But isn't it better in this case to be safe rather than sorry? The parole board can investigate these reports, and if they're not true, then, of course, he can be released again.
No, I mean, he's still a serving prisoner. He's just on life licence out in the community. I mean, for him to be recalled, he has to be a risk to life or limb. That is the test that has to be met by the parole board.
So you don't think it was a flawed decision? The Member of Parliament for the area Pitchfork committed his crimes, murders.
They want to sort out their sleaze rather than interfering in this process. Like I say...
It's his job to keep his community safe.
Well, they can do that by stop sleaze, stop fiddling expenses, etc. I did hear him waffling on about he's going to make sure this, that and the other. It's not down to him. The Parole Board actually has a High Court judge chairing it. Either side of the judge is either psychologist or psychiatrist and an independent member who might be a probation officer or such like that, or just a high-ranking member of the public. So, it is a semi-judicial procedure. I'm not saying the whole thing about the Parole Board is good, because it isn't. They're only allowed to release 20%. If it was totally independent, they could release 80% and only knock back 20% of cases.
I think most of our viewers, John, like me, would totally respect the idea that prisoners also have rights as victims have rights. And just let me finish.
They're human beings.
I'm completely with you, and you obviously have long experience of being inside prison and what it's like that I don't have. I grant you that. On the other hand, you said that the Parole Board shouldn't retain him because he wasn't a risk, in your words, to life and limb. But he doesn't have to be a risk.
It's called the Benson-Bradley test. The two court decisions in which it's been recognised by the court that the test that someone has to meet is, for recall, talking about taking his liberty off him. The test is he has to be a risk to life or limb.
But surely the terms of his, given his history, the terms of his parole almost also stipulate that he shouldn't approach young women when he's on walks. Maybe that's what the Parole Board reportedly is concerned about.
If that is in his licence conditions, then I think it's wrong, because you can't say to someone, "Oh, you're at liberty, but don't approach people." You're approaching people all the time. You can socialise. You can't turn around and say a person can't socialise. However, if he was approaching, say, 15-year-old girls or whatever, with an intention to lead them away and rape and murder them, then obviously, that is an issue.
Well, hopefully the Parole Board, John, will clarify soon precisely the reasons why that he's been restrained. But for now, we thank you for your time. John Hurst, a prisoners' rights campaigner.
And we can now talk to barrister and author Chris Daw QC, who joins us now. Chris, thank you for your time. Many people will think, what a mess the Parole Board have made of this.
They will, and I have to say I find that rather strange, because it seems to me that the system has worked perfectly. We have a situation where the Parole Board imposed some of the strictest licence conditions ever imposed on a prisoner being released, and he has breached those conditions. We actually don't know in what way precisely. There's been a lot of speculation about it, and frankly, I think some of it's disappointing, because one report is just repeated across all of the different news networks and so on. What we really need is an official announcement from the Parole Board as to exactly what the violation was, so that the public can be properly informed and so that the debate can be properly informed. But the truth of it is, whatever the breach was, it may have been a minor breach, it may have been a more significant breach, but it was sufficient for him to be recalled to prison after just a few weeks at liberty. And to me, that's a clear indication that the conditions were correctly imposed, that the risk was correctly assessed, and that ultimately the system has seen him return to prison so that he no longer represents any kind of risk to the public.
Chris, you're completely right to point out, of course, that there is still some doubt about the precise aspect of the conditions that Colin Pitchfork has breached. We've been saying that from the top of this show, and Gloria made it clear also when she was discussing this case in a previous hour here on GB News. But I put it to you, this is part of the parole board's failings. I mean, if the three of us, including you, a highly qualified QC, don't actually know what the parole board has found and is concerned about, then surely that's a communications error. There's a lack of communication strategy, communication being absolutely crucial, given, as Gloria says, the reputation of the parole board and the broader criminal justice system in this very high-profile case is at question.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the parole board that's the problem here, because the rules around what can and can't be publicised as to an individual person who's on parole are not necessarily the parole board's decisions. They're ultimately a decision for at political or government level as to the level of transparency that there should be around these things. Generally speaking, there is very little information about individuals on parole, whether for their own security or for other reasons. I have to say, in cases like this, my view would be, obviously, we don't want to reveal locations because there's a danger of vigilantism. But in terms of what exactly has happened, I absolutely agree with you. The parole board should be empowered by Parliament and the government, if necessary, to set out in detail what the breaches of the licence conditions were and the exact reasons why he was returned to prison. Because then we would all be able to have a proper discussion around this rather than speculating and talking about things in a vacuum of information.
His release was controversial. David Baker, the retired detective chief superintendent who caught Pitchfork, made this assessment of the process. He said, he felt that Pitchfork hadn't been honest with the probation service when they were making the decision. I mean, what can you do if someone isn't honest? Of course, we've got that's the interpretation of the retired detective chief superintendent.
Yeah, I mean,
how can you account for honesty or otherwise?
Well, the point that I think that the retired officer is maybe missing, and with respect to him, I doubt whether he had access to the reports that were before the parole board when the decision was made. But the reports are extensive. We're talking about psychiatric evaluations, psychological assessments. We're talking about prison records going back several years. We're talking about conduct assessments, looking at his behaviour in response to all manner of programs and treatment and psychological evaluation in prison. So there's a huge amount of information that goes into the decision of the parole board. I think it's utterly speculative on the part of the officer to suggest that the parole board was misled. There's no evidence that the parole board was misled. The only
hang on a minute. Presumably he convinced them that he would keep the terms of his licence. I mean, that is a given. If he was released on licence, then he must have convinced them that he would fulfil the terms of the restrictions that were placed upon him. So
yes, well, at least that they were satisfied that those conditions were sufficient to reduce the risk to the public. And as it's turned out, that's the case, because there has been no harm to the public. No one's been injured or harmed by the man, and the conditions have done their job. They have flagged up a potential risk because he's breached a condition. And I should say that the breaches that can lead to recall can be quite minor. In a case like this, particularly where the risk is obviously so intrinsically high from someone who's committed crimes like this, someone, for example, being late back to their hostel by 10 minutes or something like that is equally capable of leading to breach proceedings, because the standard to which someone like this will be held will be absolute. There will be no room for being a second late back to the hostel or a second late in, for example, attending a probation appointment. So the conditions will be very, very strictly enforced. So I don't think it necessarily follows that he was dishonest or lying during the parole process. What has become apparent is that he wasn't capable in reality, when it came to it, of sticking to the conditions. And that is the ultimate test. He's breached the conditions, he's back in prison. And that, for me, as I say, it's not showing that the parole board got it wrong or necessarily that he was lying or misleading the parole board. It's just showing that ultimately he's just not capable of sticking to the rules. And if he's not capable of sticking to the rules, he should be in prison where he belongs.
Chris Daw, QC, very interesting analysis from you as always. Thanks for joining us here on GB News.
No
we
problem.
want to hear your views on this. Email us gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews. We'll read your opinions later in the show.
Up next, we'll also cross to Southend, where the funeral for Sir David Amess has taken place. But just before that, it's time for your weather.
It's time to remind ourselves, there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Before the weather turns colder and much more unsettled later this week, it's a fine start to the week for many of us. Sunny spells, showers for some, mainly towards the far north, across northern parts of Scotland with these weather fronts close by, and also a few feeding into parts of southeast England. Otherwise, many places experiencing the fine weather brought about by an area of high pressure, and as a result, for the vast majority, it is a dry afternoon and a sunny one as well. Plenty of sunshine for southern Scotland, much of England, Wales into southern parts of Northern Ireland. Areas of cloud into northern Scotland, some drizzly showers and outbreaks of light rain for the far north and northwest. A little milder here, and also some showers feeding into Kent and perhaps parts of East Anglia. They'll continue into the evening and overnight with areas of cloud here, and across parts of northern Scotland will continue that feed of milder and cloudier conditions. Otherwise, clear spells and temperatures falling away. Fairly widespread frost, if not air frost, we'll certainly see a ground frost in many places, and a few fog patches to wake up to as well. Primarily across southern and southwest England, a few spots in Wales. They'll soon enough lift and clear, and for many it's a fine day once again. Plenty of dry and bright weather. Still one or two showers for parts of Kent, and still some light rain and drizzle for the north and northwest of Scotland, as well as a keen breeze. 10 Celsius in the north, 8 to 10 further south, but with, again, bright blue skies for the Midlands into South Wales and southwest England. A bit more cloud for northern England, parts of northern and western Wales, as well as East Anglia and the southeast. And actually, for many, it's a cloudier night on Tuesday night, but where we get some clear spells, fairly extensive fog forming in the south, some dense fog patches around first thing. Then it turns windier, wetter and colder later.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Join me, Alex Phillips, for the afternoon agenda on GB News, Monday to Thursday from 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. We don't lecture to you or try to tell you what to think. We do a deep delve into a topic with views from across the range of debate, therefore leaving you, the viewer, to make up your own mind. Join me, Alex Phillips, for the afternoon agenda on GB News, 4 till 6, Monday to Thursday. You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. Remember, we want to hear your opinions, and our main debate is the parole board fit for purpose.
We're asking after double child killer Colin Pitchfork was recalled to prison just 2 months after being released on parole.
Get in touch. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
But first, a private service for murdered MP Sir David Amess has taken place in his Southend West constituency, ahead of a special service at Westminster Cathedral tomorrow.
The father of 5 who was stabbed to death while holding a constituency surgery at Belfair's Methodist Church in Leigh-on-Sea last month was a devout Catholic.
Ellie Costello is our GB News South East of England reporter, and she joins us live from Southend-on-Sea. Ellie, a very moving event, I'm sure.
Hi, Liam and Gloria. Yes, a very emotional day and a very important day here for the people of Southend. I've actually just come down to Southend Civic Centre, and on that road behind me, the coffin carrying Sir David Amess has just been taken through on a horse-drawn carriage. 4 beautiful black horses were carrying that coffin. It really was a very emotional and moving spectacle, and that horse-drawn carriage paused very briefly just outside the Civic Centre behind me here, and the people fell silent and bowed their heads, and it remained there for about a minute, and then the crowd that had gathered there then broke into applause for a very much loved and very respected public servant. The horse-drawn carriage then continued down the road where Sir David Amess's constituency office was. That's where he worked. It will pause again there, where I'm sure there are very similar scenes happening there, and then his body will be taken to a chapel of rest tonight before that much larger event at Westminster Cathedral tomorrow. So the service happened about 500 metres up the road in that direction at St Mary's Church in Prittlewell, and the service was played out on loudspeakers, and people were gathering in the streets and they were etching to hear what was being said across those loudspeakers. And the coffin was draped in a Union flag, and again the crowds fell silent as the coffin was taken into the church. And the service began with a statement from the family of Sir David Amess. It was read out by a family friend, Anne Widdicombe. She read, these are the words of the family, that as a family we're trying to understand why this awful thing has occurred. Nobody should die in that way. Nobody. They said, please let some good come from this tragedy. We are absolutely broken, but we will survive and carry on for a wonderful and inspiring man. Really a very moving part of that service. Lots of people were in tears outside of the service listening to those words. A eulogy was then given by a close friend of Sir David, MP Mark Francois, who is from neighbouring Rayleigh. He spoke to me before the service about giving that eulogy. This is what he told me.
I think it's very important to Lady Julia and their children, because they've seen a massive outpouring of sympathy and empathy, not just from the people of Southend, who I think genuinely loved David, but also from people across the whole of the United Kingdom. So this is an opportunity, if you like, for Southend to grieve and to pay its respects to a man who was a phenomenal constituency MP.
You were a very close friend of Sir David, and you have the honour of doing the eulogy today. First of all, how are you feeling about that? And secondly, can you tell us a little bit about what you will be speaking about in remembering your friend?
Well, I am honoured that Lady Julia's asked me to deliver the eulogy today. There's another service at Westminster tomorrow, a full Requiem Mass, and Anne Widdicombe will be giving the eulogy then. And there's also going to be, I understand, a message from His Holiness Pope Francis, which will be read out in the cathedral as well. I'm going to do my best to do David justice. If I can do that, then hopefully it'll have been worth my turning up. And I just want to try and explain to people in the church what kind of a man he was, why you've seen this outpouring of love for the guy, and maybe throw in a couple of light-hearted anecdotes, because whenever you talk about David, inevitably there's an element of humour. He was a bit of a legend, really, and I'm going to try and explain why I say that, and why I think he'll be remembered for an extremely long time.
If it's anything like the way you spoke in the Commons, I'm sure it'll be very emotional, and a touch of humour in there as well. And you touched there upon the way he will be remembered by you. How will he be remembered by this town? And what legacy does he leave behind?
Well, you're standing in the legacy. Because of David, before long, this will be the city of Southend. And he was asked by a local newspaper, The Echo, about a year ago, how are you going to make Southend a city? And he said, I'm going to wear them down. I'm just going to keep going until they give in. And he won in the end. So Southend being a city forever will be part of David's legacy, and he'll also be remembered as a great husband and father, as a tremendous parliamentarian, and as a brilliant constituency MP.
Sure. Mark Francois speaking to me before that funeral service, and his eulogy was very fitting and a really beautiful part of the service. He said whatever the weaknesses of Parliament, David was the embodiment of all its strength. Really beautiful words from his friend Mark Francois there. Well, there will be that larger event tomorrow at Westminster Cathedral, a much more political affair where we will see politicians from across all parties gathering to pay their respects to Sir David. But today's event was about Sir David's family, about his friends, and about local people saying goodbye to a much loved and much respected public servant.
Thank you, Ellie Costello there. Ellie Costello from Southend-on-Sea, GB News' South East reporter.
Right after this break, it's all about your opinion. Join the debate next on Piero and Halligan. First, it's the news headlines.
I'm Paul Hawkins. As you've just been hearing, our top story this hour is that mourners have been paying their respects to the politician Sir David Amess during a funeral service and procession in his Southend West constituency. Sir David's coffin, draped in a Union flag, was carried to the church by members of Southend Fire and Rescue Service. The father of 5 was stabbed to death while holding a surgery at Belfair's Methodist Church in Leigh-on-Sea in October. Energy provider Bulb has said it's going into administration following challenging market conditions. The company blamed the rising cost of gas prices and what it calls volatile market situation, but said it will still provide a service as normal to its 1.7 million customers. More than 20 providers have collapsed in recent months following a big rise in the wholesale price of gas. 5 people have died and more than 40 have been injured after a car ploughed through a Christmas parade in the American state of Wisconsin. An SUV broke through barriers in the city of Waukesha yesterday afternoon, hitting dozens of people, including children. One eyewitness said the SUV was doing 40 miles per hour when it hit the crowd. The Prime Minister says Britain can win the new green industrial revolution, but only if we act now. Boris Johnson has been speaking to business industry leaders at the CBI National Conference from the Port of Tyne in South Shields. He also announced that new homes in England must have electric car charging points from next year. You're up to date with the latest. We'll have more for you at 3.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
And welcome back. Today on Piero and Halligan, we're talking about the decision to recall the double child killer Colin Pitchfork to prison.
He was released 2 months ago by the Parole board after spending 33 years in jail for murdering 15-year-olds Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in Leicestershire in the 1980s.
Pitchfork was returned to custody on Friday over a breach of licence conditions, and we're delighted to be joined now by former Chief Superintendent Parm Sandhu. Superintendent Sandhu, good to have you with us on GB News. We were talking to Chris Daw, QC, earlier, very well-informed guy. It's clear that the Parole Board hasn't made clear the precise terms in which Colin Pitchfork breached the conditions of his parole, but clearly he breached them in some sense. Do you think this shows the Parole Board is working or the Parole Board is failing?
First of all, I would like to extend my sympathies to the families involved because their pain is never going to go away. You know, after 33 years, we're giving this man freedom to walk the streets, but their pain is never going to go. And my concern with the Parole Board is the lack of transparency in that, you know, we can have members of the public sitting in court listening to cases. We could have members of the public going to the Houses of Parliament listening to, or you know, you've got TV cameras in there and you can listen to debates. How do we not have that same level of transparency in the decision-making of parole boards so that we're all sitting here, we're all trying to guess why they let Colin Pitchfork out, and we don't actually know what those reasons are? And for me, one of the big questions that you have to ask is, what is this man a danger to the public now? And from everything that we've seen, heard recently, yes, he is. So how was the decision made to actually release him?
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, actually. In your view, how robust is the Parole Board investigation? He applied to be released in 2016 and 2018. That was blocked. So what changed in 2021? Is it unusual? It feels unusual.
It does feel unusual, but somehow he has convinced the Parole Board that he is no longer a danger to, and it's children. These are young children that he murdered. So somehow he has convinced the psychologists, the doctors, you know, everybody who's been involved with him that he no longer presents a danger to young children. But my concern is, where were the victims' families' voices? Where were the voices that could have said, well, this is what happened and this is the lasting pain that we have to live with? And that lack of transparency is an issue. And when we're talking about reform and about moving forward, perhaps this is the time that we should have more accountability and more transparency and scrutiny over the decision-making processes.
Clearly a balance to be struck, isn't there, Parm Sandhu? On the one hand, we do want the Parole Board to be transparent and open, particularly in a case like this where public confidence is at stake, given the horrendous nature of Pitchfork's crimes and the high-profile nature of this case. On the other hand, we do have to protect victims and their families from a privacy point of view and a reprisal point of view. And, of course, we have to protect perpetrators to some extent from vigilantism, as Chris Daw QC pointed out earlier. But you think the balance is too skewed towards a lack of transparency at the moment?
I do believe that people can be rehabilitated, and when they are no longer a danger to the public, yes, they should be released and they should be allowed to make a meaningful contribution to society. However, we've got to be 100% sure that the individuals that we put back out on the streets are no longer a danger. And it has obviously been proved that this man is still a danger to young girls or young children. So that's where I feel that there should be more transparency in that decision making, because then more information can be taken into account before the decision is made to release an individual like this. So I think that there is a need for greater scrutiny, greater transparency and accountability before this decision was made and is made in the future.
Palm, I'm interested in your view on the remarks of the detective who caught Colin Pitchfork. Obviously, it's a long time ago, but when the parole board last summer recommended his release, he said it was wrong. He called him a psychopath. When you arrest somebody, I mean, are you really in a position to know what sort of character there are? What do you learn during that process that might still be relevant so many decades later?
I think the reason that the arresting officer made those comments was because this man had persuaded somebody to do the blood test for him so that he wasn't caught out on the DNA. So he didn't just commit murders, he then had an elaborate way of hiding who he was and what he was, because it wasn't just the murders that he committed. He'd also assaulted other young children. He'd been accused and had come to notice for flashing at young girls and victims before. So there was a whole host of different actions by this man where he tried to hide his true character. Now, if he had been rehabilitated and he wasn't a danger to the public, then how come he's come to notice again so quickly? So I feel that the arresting officer based those comments on the fact that there was a whole catalogue of events and a catalogue of behaviours by this man, which showed that he was more than just a murderer. He committed murder twice, and we don't even know the full extent of his offending in the past.
Palm Sandhu, former Chief Superintendent there, thank you for your insights into this very difficult case.
Really interesting insights, thank you. The Parole Board released a statement a little early today saying Parole Board panels rely heavily on the evidence of professional witnesses who have the benefit of monitoring and working closely with an offender throughout their sentence.
The Parole Board statement went on. The Parole Board's judicial decision to release Mr Pitchfork was made in May and followed consideration of extensive evidence from his community probation officer, prison probation officer and prison psychologist, who all supported his release.
The Secretary of State at the time, the statement goes on to say, was also represented at the hearing and did not oppose his release at the hearing. Mr Pitchfork's case has not yet been referred to the board. A further update will be provided when this happens.
Well, the plot thickens, as it were. We're joined now by criminal defence lawyer, author and commentator Nick Freeman. Nick, good to have you with us as ever. Just, as a lawyer, I mean, we're two journalists here. We cover, crime and the justice system a lot, but we're still quite confused. It seems Chris Daw QC is a bit confused as well, because we don't actually know why Colin Pitchfork has been recalled to prison, because the Parole Board statements so far have either been non-existent or hedging. What do you know?
We know, that first of all, the Parole Board got it wrong. That doesn't mean to say they're not fit for purpose, but they clearly got it wrong. They were hoodwinked, they had the wool pulled over their eyes. The reason that he was recalled was because he breached the conditions. Normally when someone's granted parole, they normally have maybe 4 conditions attached to their parole. In this particular instance, there were over 40 conditions. And if you feel that the risk is so severe that you must impose that degree of restriction on the release, surely common sense would dictate that the risk is actually so great that we need to prioritise not the defendant's rights, but really public safety. And that doesn't appear to have happened in this particular case. So we know he's breached his conditions. We're not quite sure how. We hear from the media that he's tried to approach and befriend teenage girls to establish a connection with them. We don't know whether that's true or false. If that is true, that seems to suggest a similar pattern of conduct to what happened right back in 1983, which we do know about. So the reason he's recalled is he's breached the conditions. It will be brought back before the Parole Board within 28 days, and then there will probably be a full hearing within the next 6 months. So that's what we know. How much more we get to know from that, we'll have to wait and see. But when we ask the question, have they got it wrong? without question, they've got it wrong. This isn't something the parole board and all those witnesses and everyone who's given evidence has been hoodwinked by a man who was very deceptive back at the time that he committed these heinous crimes. As you heard the previous contributor say, he tried to persuade somebody else to take a sample of blood to exculpate him from his own involvement. That's how devious he was then. And there have been stories that were available for the parole board during the hearing that he'd actually suggested to one woman, he was in an open prison, it's important to bear in mind that, so he had day release. And on one occasion, he told a lady that he was married, and he bought her a box of chocolates to thank her for something, again, because he was subject to, so that was a lie. So the deception is there, and he clearly remains the same man that he's always been. But the issue is, how apparent was that to the people who judged him? And all we can say is that he must be a very devious but very smart person, because he's pulled the wool over some very intelligent people. And that, unfortunately, does happen from time to time. The interesting thing I would like to add is, had that offence occurred now, this was back in 1983, had this offence occurred now, since 2003, the chances are that almost certainly he would have a whole life sentence, and the conversation about parole would be non-existent, because he simply would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And that's always something that the parole board can take into account. When they're considering whether they should grant parole, that they consider literally anything that they want to. So they consider his previous conduct, but more pertinently, what his future plans are and what risk does he pose to the public. And as you've rightly said, he's made 2 previous applications not that long ago and failed. So what has actually changed? Only the expiration of time, only the fact that he's now served 33 years in prison behind bars. If his character hasn't changed after 28 and 30 years, why should it change after 33 years? I think that's a reasonable question, and that the answer to that question is it hasn't changed at all, as is evidenced by the fact that his licence has been revoked, and we'll have to see now what's going to happen to him. He's now in a closed prison, and I anticipate that he will stay there for some time, but he's eligible to make another application, possibly for parole in about 2023. And, we need to know what's going to happen about that.
Nick, always good to get your insights here on GB News. Thanks for your time. Nick Freeman there, criminal defence lawyer.
Now we are joined by Professor of Criminology at Staffordshire University, James Treadwell. James, good to see you again. Do the parole board owe the families of the victims an apology?
I think in this case they certainly do, yeah, and I think the parole board have got it wrong. I'd agree with others. I think what I would also say, and I'd caveat that a little bit, because I think the parole board very often do get it right. They're actually quite good when it comes to a number of cases, essentially establishing that somebody has met the conditions for release. Where they seem to get it wrong spectacularly is in these very high profile cases, which then undermines the logic for the parole board, where we want the parole board to be beyond question in some ways, is in very, very high profile cases with very profile individuals, with the terrorists, with the John War boys, with cases like Colin Pitchfork. And the fact that it's in those instances where they seem to be naive to the realities of the harm and the deception that people are willing to do, that leads to more general questions about whether the parole board is fit for purpose.
While viewers' sympathies, James, will be overwhelmingly with Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann, and of course their families, the victims' families, don't we just need to be slightly careful before we rush to judgment? Because we don't know the terms of the parole stipulations that were breached. It may be, as Chris Dorr QC pointed out earlier, it may just be he was 5 minutes late back to his hostel for an innocent reason, and the terms were then technically broken, so they had to return him to prison for now.
I think that's quite unlikely, and I'd agree with the previous guest that when you're beginning to put 43 conditions onto somebody, it suggests that safety was never there. And I think in this case, the wrong judgment call was reached. I said all along, I think there is a distinct difference between, and this is an understanding of the criminal and the offending type. There's a difference between a homicide, a murder, and someone who would murder and then murder again. Pitchfork was clearly involved in an entrenched pattern of sexual offending and then violent, murderous criminality that put him beyond the pale for me, and therefore that's why he was supervised so heavily in the community. And that is different to someone, for example, who in drink and drugs might kill an acquaintance and then regret it, serve a life sentence, and then have to be managed in the community. Murder is not murder. I've sat across opposite from a lot more murderers than the average person, and very often two are not alike, but there are differences in degree and severity in some instances particularly. And this is a problem we have stored up for the future as well, because, for example, while we talk about, the changes that have been brought in a system whereby people now get life without the possibility of parole, there are profile individuals, people like Ian Huntley, who are sat on life sentences with tariff periods, who may come up and be eligible for release at some point in the future. And the parole board could again be making a judgment call there about the release of those individuals. And I think, public confidence requires a bit of a change, a rebalancing, and a recognition that some people are beyond the pale. They're not savable. There is no salvation when you've done something as heinous and as terrible as those individuals.
James, very, very briefly,
I had one then.
What do you think will happen?
I think we'll find with Pitchfork that he's breached the terms of his condition. He'll likely end up back in prison custody, and I think it may be quite some time before he's considered again. I think more detail will emerge, but I would imagine that the stories that we're hearing in the press at the moment are probably not a million miles away from what's happened. And in this instance, it's good to see that the authorities have acted rapidly to kind of get him back into custody. But of course, the very fact that someone has come out and has had that degree of liberty is not one that's without risk. And thank God tragedy's been averted this time and there have been no more victims. But for me, it was an experiment that didn't need to happen, because he should never have been in that situation anyway.
James Treadwell, Professor of Criminology, thanks for that contribution.
You've been emailing us on this. John says the fact he killed and raped two young girls should have kept him in jail for his entire life.
Roy, I think prisoners lose their rights when they're sent to prison.
Tanith says in the case of causing death on purpose, life should mean life. The family and friends will never get parole.
And Jay, finally, Pitchfork's appalling crimes were 3 years. In my opinion, this makes him very, very high risk, and I would never have given him
That's all we've got time for. Thank you for being with us. Darren's next.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Before the weather turns colder and much more unsettled later this week, it's a fine start to the week for many of us. Sunny spells, showers for some, mainly towards the far north, across northern parts of Scotland, with these weather fronts close by, and also a few feeding into parts of southeast England. Otherwise, many places experiencing the fine weather brought about by an area of high pressure, and as a result, for the vast majority, it is a dry afternoon and a sunny one as well. Plenty of sunshine for southern Scotland, much of England, Wales, into southern parts of Northern Ireland. Areas of cloud into northern Scotland, some drizzly showers and outbreaks of light rain for the far north and northwest. A little milder here, and also some showers feeding into Kent and perhaps parts of East Anglia. They'll continue into the evening and overnight, with areas of cloud here, and across parts of northern Scotland will continue that feed of milder and cloudier conditions. Otherwise, clear spells and temperatures falling away. Fairly widespread frost, if not air frost, we'll certainly see a ground frost in many places, and a few fog patches to wake up to as well, primarily across southern and southwest England, a few spots in Wales. They'll soon enough lift and clear, and For many, it's a fine day once again. Plenty of dry and bright weather. Still 1 or 2 showers for parts of Kent, and still some light rain and drizzle for the north and northwest of Scotland, as well as a keen breeze. 10 Celsius in the north, 8 to 10 further south, but with, again, bright blue skies for the Midlands into South Wales and southwest England. A bit more cloud for northern England, parts of northern and western Wales, as well as East Anglia and the southeast. And actually, for many, it's a cloudier night on Tuesday night, but where we get some clear spells. Fairly extensive fog forming in the south, some dense fog patches around first thing. Then it turns windier, wetter and colder later.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Hey, it's Monday afternoon. Hello and welcome to the briefing here on GB News with me, Darren McCaffrey. Over the next hour, we're going to provide you with your afternoon fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis. Today, particularly a special attention on Northern Ireland, a week long of programming on that, but also talking social care, coronavirus and a Welsh political deal. That and much more in just a couple of minutes after the news with Paul.
Thanks, Darren. Our top story then at 3. Mourners have paid their respects to the politician Sir David Amess at a funeral service in his Southend West constituency. The father of 5 was stabbed to death while holding a surgery at Belfair's Methodist Church in Leigh-on-Sea in October. Sir David's coffin, draped in a Union flag, was carried to the church by members of Southend Fire and Rescue Service. Energy provider Bulb has said it's going into administration because of challenging market conditions. The company blamed the rising cost of gas prices and what it calls volatile market situation, but said it will still provide a